Hello and welcome to this video on Introduction to Statistics in Critical Appraisal, Part 1. In these short tutorials, we're going to look at common statistics which appear in research papers and how to interpret them to aid you in critical appraisal. In Part 1, we will focus on odds and risk ratios. Often you will notice within the literature that the authors have included either an odds ratio or a risk ratio. Risk ratio is also known as relative risk. These are different concepts but can be confused for each other as they do share some similarities. Simply put, the odds ratio is focusing on the odds of an event occurring between two groups, the intervention and the comparison groups, while the risk ratio is focusing on the risk of an event occurring between the two groups. So when we see an odds ratio or a risk ratio, what do these figures actually mean? The answer is based around the number 1. Where the figure is equal to 1, this would demonstrate that the odds or risk of the event occurring between our intervention comparison groups are the same. If the figure is greater than 1, then the odds or the risk of the outcome developing in the intervention group is higher, while if the figure is lower than 1, then the odds or risk of developing the outcome in the intervention group is lower. As part of this, how you interpret these figures will also depend on the outcome or outcomes of interest, i.e. the outcome being investigated will affect whether you want to see an odds or risk ratio which is higher or lower than 1. For example, if the outcome being investigated was death, we would hope to see a figure which is less than 1, as this would tell us that the intervention has reduced the incidence of this occurring. However, if we are looking at a beneficial outcome, we would want to see an odds or risk ratio figure which is higher than 1, to show there is a greater likelihood of developing that outcome in the intervention group than the comparison group. Let's apply what we know to a real-life example from a 2022 paper on fluvoxamine versus placebo for the early treatment of COVID-19. The outcomes of interest are reducing clinical deterioration and hospitalization. Fluvoxamine is the intervention group and the comparison group is the placebo. The risk ratio has been given as 0.86. So what does this suggest to us? You may like to pause the video here and have to think about what the answer may be. The risk ratio here is 0.86, which is less than 1. A risk ratio of less than 1 tells us that the risk of the outcome occurring is lower in the intervention group than in the comparison group. Therefore, a risk ratio of 0.86 would suggest that fluvoxamine is more effective than placebo at reducing the risk of clinical deterioration and hospitalization in patients with COVID-19. Remember, these figures are there to assist with appraising papers, and it is still important to consider the paper as a whole. Let's take a look now at how to calculate these figures. It is not essential for you to calculate the odds and risk ratio, but it may help with your understanding of these figures and if you want to double check any risk or odds ratios included in the paper. To calculate the odds ratio, you need to divide the number of people who had the outcome by the number who did not. You will then need to do this for each group. You will then need to divide the figure from the intervention group by the figure from the comparison group. In our example here, there were 5 people in the intervention group who had the outcome of interest and 15 who did not. In the comparison group, 11 people had the outcome of interest and 9 did not. We therefore get a figure of 0.33 for the intervention and 1.22 for the comparison group. What do you think the odds ratio is here? Pause the video here to calculate. The answer is 0.27 after dividing 0.33 by 1.22. The risk ratio is calculated in a different way. Here you will divide the number of people who had the outcome by the overall total number of people in that group. And again, you will need to do this for the intervention and comparison groups. You will then divide the intervention figure by the comparison figure. In this example, the intervention group had 20 people, with 5 having the outcome of interest. The comparison group also had 20 people, with 10 having the outcome of interest. What do you think the risk ratio would be? Pause the video here if you want to have a go. The answer is 0.5, after we have divided the intervention figure of 0.25 from the comparison figure of 0.5. This brings us to the end of part 1. If you need further support with critical appraisal, contact your site library, view our other videos on YouTube, or check out our Moodle course on the Trust's Moodle page.